Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The lecture of pathology today is about the irreversible injury, which include reversible injury, include apoptosis and necrosis, and the apoptosis occurs as a result of an internally controlled suicide programmed cell death, after which the dead cells are removed. This occurs in physiologic states when unwanted cells are removed, for example through embryogenesis, as well as in a variety of pathological state, either physiological or pathological state, such as in irreparable mutational damage in the DNA, كونها pathology. While the necrosis is mostly occur as pathological cell death. Cellular change, the typical example of necrosis, is a coagulative necrosis, which occurs after a loss of blood supply or after an exposure to toxin, characterized by cellular swelling or protein denaturation. Protein denaturation means the protein loss of normal molecular structure due to effect of the bonds, particularly the hydrogen bonds between its molecule structure, and organelles break down, result in considerable tissue dysfunction. There are two phenomena consistently characterize the irreversible injury or necrosis or cell death. The first is the inability to reverse mitochondrial dysfunction. Inability to reverse mitochondrial dysfunction, which means lack of oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic respiration that result in ATP production. Irreparable to reverse mitochondrial dysfunction even after resolution or remove the initial or original causes, such as the restoration of blood supply. يعني إذا كان الكوزز هو blood deprivation of or hypoxia or ischemia, resulted in cell death or necrosis, حتى وإن صار perfusion للنكروتيك area or affected area، هي بعد تكون irreversible injury. The second is the development of profound disturbance in cell and membrane function. Profound disturbance in also irreversible change or defect in membrane function. This is a two important or significant or pathognomonic phenomena in or signs in irreversible injury: inability to reverse mitochondrial dysfunction and a profound disturbance in plasma membrane. Sequence events in irreversible injury. The first one is extensive damage to all membranes, including plasma membrane, nuclear membrane, mitochondrial membrane, rough endoplasmic membrane, and so on. The second is swelling and rupture of lysosomes, resulting in release of their enzymes, and the acid hydrolysis are activated. دائما يصير لها activation بالacidic environment with increased calcium concentration. Hydrolysis enzymes are activated in the reduced intracellular pH of the ischemic cell and degrade cytoplasmic and nuclear components. The third is vacuolation of mitochondria, with resulting in reduced capacity to generate or produce ATP. extracellular calcium enters the cell and intracellular calcium stores are released, resulting in the activation of enzymes that can catabolize membranes, all membranes, يعني membrane of cell and membrane of cellular organelles, and protein, ATP, and nucleic acid. The earliest ultrastructural markers of irreversible injury is the accumulation of large amorphous which be calcium-rich densities in the mitochondrial matrix. Dead cells may be replaced by large walled phospholipid masses called myelin figures. These phospholipid precipitates are then either phagocytosed by other cells or further degraded into fatty acids, which then undergo calcification and resulted in generation of calcium salts, saponification, or as occurring calcification. Mechanisms. These figures illustrate the mechanism of irreversible injury. As example, the ischemic injury. Here, good example is ischemic injury occur in coronary artery, particularly due to thrombus, resulting in ischemia, blood deprivation, and loss of blood and glucose, means loss of oxygen and glucose in the cell. The cell will undergo depletion in Krebs cycle or oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic respiration, which is responsible for production and of ATP. This will affect and reduce the ATP production, and the mitochondria will convert or replace the oxidative phosphorylation by anaerobic glycolysis، لأنه راح يصير decrease in aerobic glycolysis، وراح يصير anaerobic glycolysis، and anaerobic glycolysis will result in lactic acid, increased concentration of lactic acid, resulting in increase or convert the acidity of internal environment, increase acidity of cellular environment, intracellular environment, and this will result in increased sodium influx and calcium influx. Increased acidity with increased calcium concentration. This will result to activate the phospholipases, which result in cell membrane damage of phospholipid in cell membrane. إنه يعني structure in cell membrane موجودة phospholipids في الphospholipases will result in degradation of phospholipid in cell membrane, and also activation of other enzymes, nucleases, proteases, and lipases, and other. On the other hand, the sodium potassium pump will affected due to it is dependent on ATP production, and when the mitochondria affect, the ATP will reduce, and this will reflect on the sodium potassium pump function. This will increase sodium influx and potassium influx. Sodium is mostly associated with water influx, resulting in water overload in the cell, and all of these defects will result in necrosis or cell death, which means irreversible injury. The three morphologic or three-step morphological steps in nuclei in necrosis اللي حكينا عنها. بالمحاضرة السابقة يمكن قلنا هنا هي البيجنوسيس والكاريوريكسيس and الكاريوليسيس. البيجنوسيس means the nuclei become smaller and condensed and deeply stained with basophilic stain due to يعني chromatin clumping. due to chromatin clumping بتكون small and condensed with dark hematoxylin stain. Karyorrhexis. Second step, الkaryorrhexis means the pygnotic nuclei will break down into smaller fragments and scattered through the cytoplasm of cell, and then this pygnotic or fragments will completely lysis and disappear in the cytoplasm. A pygnotic cell may be extruded from the cell, or it may manifest progressive loss of chromatin staining. This microscopic field illustrates a typical example of coagulative necrosis, illustrating the 3 steps of nuclear necrosis. The pygnosis means condensation of nuclei and appear as smaller in size and dark basophilic stain, while in this example the cell or the chromatin appear as a fragmented chromatin. This means the karyorrhexis, and others here nearly there is an example of karyolysis due to complete dissolution of fragmented chromatin. There are 6 types of necrosis or 5 types of necrosis. لأنه الجنجرين يعني يعتبر coagulative. The first one is coagulative necrosis. Means coagulative in the case of coagulative necrosis, preservation of the basic structural outline of the tissue of coagulated cells and general tissue architecture. يعني راح يصير maintenance the outline only, not the details. The details will be completely defected and dissoluted. Only preserve the outline structure of coagulated cells and tissue architecture for a span of day, يعني لفترة محدودة, not continue for a long time. يعني ممكن إنه يعني 1 week or 2 weeks, and then will undergo complete lysis or liquefaction. The injury or increasing acidosis denatures not only the structural protein but also the enzymatic proteins, thus blocking cellular proteolysis. يعني شنو الفرق؟ أنه راح بهذا التعريف أنه راح نشوف الأوتلاين يعني maintained of cells and tissue, لأنه denaturation will affect not only the structural protein, راح ما يأثر فقط على structural protein but also will affect on enzymatic protein, لأنه الإنزيمات اللي قلنا هي راح يسوي لنا complete lysis للسيلز, هاي يعني أيضا راح يعني will undergo denaturation, فراح يصير بها defect, ولذلك تبقى for يعني certain period, and then this affected tissue will يعني catabolized by يعني lysosomal enzymes of inflammatory cells and other adjacent cells. A typical example is myocardial infarction. يعتبر prime example of coagulative necrosis, in which acidophilic coagulated and unnucleated cells may persist for weeks لأسابيع, بعدين يصير بها complete karyolysis. Ultimately, the necrotic myocardial cells are removed by fragmentation and phagocytosis by scavenger white blood cells. These include either neutrophils or macrophages. The process of coagulative necrosis is characteristic of hypoxic death of cells in all tissue except the brain. دائما consequence or complication of ischemic or hypoxic injury of cells. الكونسيكونس مالته والنتيجة والأوتكم هي تكون الكوagulative necrosis except in the brain. يعني إذا صار عندنا ischemic injury or hypoxic injury in the liver and the kidney, mostly complicated or resulted in coagulative necrosis except in the brain. دائما تكون النتيجة هي liquefactive necrosis. يقولون لأنه البرين هو يكون rich with fats. This figure shows gross appearance of typical example about coagulative necrosis in the kidney, where appear the affected area as pale triangle shape including the renal cortex and descend into middle, and take the triangle shape which reflect the distribution of the branching of affected artery. يعني ممكن أنه صار هنا occlusion يعني infarction بالsecondary branch of renal artery. بعدين ماخذ شكل الديستريبيوشن لأنه هنا الارتري اللي هنا يغذي هاي المنطقة فقط، فإنه صاير الابستراكشن أو الانفاركشن هير، فراح ياخذ شكل الديستريبيوشن مالت الاريا اللي هي supplied by this affected artery. This microscopic examples about coagulative necrosis here in the heart. The affected or necrotized myocardial cells appear with deeply eosinophilic stain. إنه تأخذ يعني هي characteristic features of necrotized or يعني coagulative necrosis يأخذ dark eosinophilic stain compared with viable myocardial cells بتكون paler than necrotized. Now عندنا viable myocardial cells. In this field, coagulative necrosis of renal cortex, which appear only maintenance or preservation of the outline of renal tubules, but without nuclei or cell borders, only ghost or outline of renal tubules, acellular, anuclear, dark or deeply eosinophilic stain. Also the glomerulus appear acellular, anuclear, and there is no nuclei, there is no borders of cells, only ghost of glomerulus surrounded with ghost of or shadow of coagulated necrotized renal tubules. This is a typical example about coagulative necrosis. Also other example about coagulative necrosis in renal tubules, but the glomeruli appear intact here. On the high magnification illustrate the necrotized renal tubules. Coagulative necrosis in the heart due to myocardial infarction resulted in the complete necrosis and of myocardial cells with maintenance the outline but disappearance of their nuclei, only the outline of myocardial fibers, losing their nuclei and take dark or deep eosinophilic stain. While here the inflammatory cells, particularly the neutrophils start to engulf and dissolute the يعني completely removing of the necrotized myocardial cells. يعني بعد يسوينا removing و clearance liquefaction necrotized myocardial cells. This on the high magnification appear يعني necrotized myocardial fibers and in between inflammatory cells, predominantly the neutrophils. The second type is liquefactive necrosis, is characteristic of focal bacterial or sometimes fungal infection. يعني reflect بالcoagulative necrosis, liquefactive necrosis. Typical characteristic ويكون بالfocal bacterial أو focal fungal infection, where this will stimulate accumulation of white blood cell, particularly in neutrophils. يعني بحالة focal bacterial أو fungal دائما يصير collection, accumulation و filtration of massive of neutrophils أو اللي نسميها polymorph nuclear cells اللي هي الsource of liquefaction أو liquefactive necrosis خصوصا بحالة الأبسس, which in turn increase liquefaction and completely digest the dead cells. Hypoxic death of cell within the central nervous system also result in liquefactive necrosis. هذا قلنا قبل شوي قلنا بالهايبوكسيا والاسكيميا دائما بالCNS يكون هو liquefactive necrosis. This microscopic feature shows typical example of liquefactive necrosis, where in the center appear liquefied homogeneous material represent the liquefactive center of necrosis, surrounded with viable, طبعا هذه تكون من died or dead neutrophils and necrotic debris with causative agent اللي قلنا أما يكون bacterial أو fungal infection. يعني causative agent اللي يكون necrotic debris with died neutrophils due to the activity of lysosomal enzymes and other enzymes result in liquefaction of this center, surrounded with a color of or ring of viable neutrophils in the periphery, while this illustrates the viable glomerular. The second type is caseous necrosis. Caseous necrosis is a distinctive form of necrosis, يعني هو other entity or other term of necrosis encountered most often in foci or of a tuberculous infection. بحالة tuberculosis, the term of caseous is derived from the cheesy white-like gross appearance of the central necrotic area. مثلا بحالة التيوبركلز, بحالة اللي هي يعني المفرد مال أو lesion of tuberculosis يسمونها التيوبركلز لأنه أو الدرنة. السنتر مالته هو typical example of caseous necrosis, تكون عبارة عن cheesy like material و white تبين cheesy white grossly. Microscopically, the necrotic focus is composed of structureless amorphous granular debris. يعني structureless يعني loss of outline, loss of يعني acellular and nuclear loss of outline. احنا بالcoagulative ممكن انه يكون التشو بعدها يعني maintain its outline التشو او السيلز. بالcoagulative لا, بالكازياس لا, بالكازياس يكون loss of its يعني يكون structureless و amorphous و granular debris only, يعني lost of all their tissues يكون loss of architecture and outlines enclosed within distinctive ring of granulomatous inflammation ودائما تكون surrounded with مثلا بهاي حالة الجروس اللي تبين tuberculous lesion of tuberculosis السنتر مالتها هو الكيزيس نكروسيس ودائما تكون surrounded with تكون طبعا هي cheesy like material تبين white grossly وتكون surrounded with fibrous connective tissue أو granulomatous inflammation. Unlike coagulative necrosis, the tissue architecture is completely obliterated يعني منمحي تماما. هنا قلنا tuberculous lung with large area of caseous necrosis. The caseous debris is yellow-white, cheesy appearance, grossly طبعا. Other example tuberculosis هنا عندنا gross appearance appear in يعني tuberculosis affect the hilar lymph nodes اللي قلنا عليها هي regional lymph node of lung الهايلر lymph node وين جاي يعني التي بي transport الميكوبكتيريوم tuberculosis transport into hilar lymph node السنتر مالتها اللي يبين cheesy tan white appearance هو ال typical example about the caseous necrosis. هنا microscopic appearance of tubercles هو الجرانيلوما نسميها السنتر مالتها هو اللي يكون example about caseous necrosis which appear as amorphous structureless nuclear cellular amorphous and appear as a granular appearance with يعني eosinophilic stain مثل ما تشوفون هذا هو يعني السنتر اللي يمثل الكيزيس نكروسيس اللي هو سنتر اوف التيوبركلز او الجرانيلوما هنا على هاي magnification as you see. The fourth type is fatty necrosis. It is another well accepted term. It's described focal area of fatty destruction. Fatty destruction يعني pre-existing fatty destruction and unremoved fatty destruction. Typically occurring after pancreatic injury, most associated with pancreatic or acute pancreatitis, which resulting from pathological release of activated pancreatic enzymes. Resulted from pathological release of activated pancreatic enzymes into adjacent pancreatic parenchyma and adipose tissue surrounding the pancreas or peritoneal cavity مثل اللايبيزز وغيرها يعني release of this pancreatic enzymes to surrounding tissue result in mostly fatty destruction and fat necrosis. This occur in the disastrous abdominal emergency known as acute pancreatitis. Activated pancreatic enzymes escape from acinar cells لأنه يصير بها destruction حالة الأكيوت pancreatitis فيصير leakage of their enzyme and ducts from acinar cells and ducts into the tissue resulting in liquefying fatty cell membrane الغشاء القلوي للفات cell راح يصير بيه liquefying and hydrolyzing the triglyceride esters contained within cell membrane of fat cell and release fatty acids which combined with calcium to produce grossly visible chalky white masses or areas اللي يسمونها fat saponification which help to identify this disease on simple inspection. This disease يقصد أنه الأكيوت pancreatitis من خلال تكون هاي الفاتي saponification إذا شافوها بالبنكرياس يعني على أنه indicator على الأكيوت pancreatitis على أنه صاير leakage للإنزيماتيك active enzyme pancreatic enzymes وسوي destruction للفاتي tissue وصار بيها fatty necrosis وسابونيفيكيشن لأنه صار ارتباط بالfatty acids with the calcium at the affected site. Microscopically appear only as shadowy outline of necrotic fatty cells. May be seen with basophilic calcium deposits, يعني similar to that seen in the case of calcification, and surrounded with inflammatory reaction. Necrotic cells and their debris disappear by enzyme digestion and leukocyte phagocytosis, while if the necrotic cells and cellular debris are not promptly eliminated, they tend to attract calcium salt and other minerals and undergo dystrophic calcification. مثل ما حكينا قبل المحاضرة اللي قبلها أنه النكروتيك اريا إذا بقت for long time يعني except يعني إذا كان بالفاتي تيشو أنه راح يصير بفاتي نكروسيس، أما بالother type of tissue إذا كان unremoved necrotic tissue for long time راح يجي الكالسيوم ويصير بالdeposition at the affected site ويصير بmineralization and dystrophic calcification. This is typical example about fatty necrosis represented by this white chalky or white yellow chalky masses in the mesentery which represent calcium salt formation at the site of lipid breakdown. يعني اكو pre-existing fatty destruction, fat tissue destruction وصاير ريليز للترايغليسرايد and fatty acid بعدين الكالسيوم لأنه هذا affinity to combine with fatty acids فصار بي depositing at the site of fatty destruction resulting in fatty necrosis and mesentery. The first type is fibrinoid necrosis. Fibrinoid necrosis is an alteration of injured blood vessels. An alteration of injured blood vessels. Fibrinoid necrosis mostly restrict to affected blood vessels, particularly the arteries, in which inundation and accumulation of plasma proteins يعني انسلال أو نضح أو تجمع البلازما proteins cause the wall to stand intensely with eosine مثل as you see here. The term is sometimes misnomer because the eosinophilia obscures the underlying alteration in the blood vessels, making it difficult to determine whether they are truly necrosis in the vascular wall or no. يعني يقولون انه هو مو احتمال انه يكون misnomer لانه مو اكيد احتمال only صاير leakage of plasma protein و deposition و excessive accumulation of plasma protein in the vascular cell wall و not represent true necrosis, only صار obscuring for vascular wall cells. But sometimes this deposition of plasma protein resulted in necrosis of vascular wall. فينطبق عليه يعني يكون true term of fibrinoid necrosis. This typical example of fibrinoid necrosis occur in inflamed muscular artery with a patient with systemic artery. طبعا يصير ليكج لأنه أكو بحالة الانفلاميشن of vessels مثل systemic arteritis أو غيرها يصير leakage of plasma protein from the wall of arteries resulting in deposition of plasma protein on this wall, and excessive deposition will result in atrophy and necrosis of this vascular wall and hyalinization of this affected arteries, which appear here surrounded with massive infiltration of inflammatory cells, predominantly the neutrophils, acute arthritis, muscular arthritis. Gangrenous necrosis is other entity of necrosis, but it refers to pre-existing coagulative necrosis or ischemic coagulative necrosis, frequently occur in the limb and foot, and in most cases superimposed with bacterial infection. يعني هو بالأساس coagulative necrosis and superimposed with bacterial infection. There are 4 types of gangrene: dry gangrene, gas gangrene, moist gangrene, and wet gangrene. The only one, dry gangrene, is the only one not superimposed with the bacteria, bacterial infection. Therefore, the affected tissue in the dry gangrene appear as dry and shriveled and discolored, which is only represent severe coagulative necrosis, as in this example, this typical example of a dry gangrene in the foot. Again, most common site here, limb and the foot, appear discolored into brown, dark brown or black color, and the foot appear dried and shriveled and shrinked. This is represent a dry gangrene. The other 3 types of gangrene, gas gangrene, moist gangrene, and wet gangrene, are superimposed with different type of bacteria, where the gas gangrene superimposed with gas-producing bacteria, from its name, gas, superimposed with gas-producing bacteria, which proliferate in the affected or necrotic tissue, اللي هو قلنا دائما يكون coagulative necrosis. The affected tissue has a cracked crepitant field، يعني قرقعة تبين عندما يعني مر الهاند تحس اكو فد crepitation or crackled feeling، قرقعة due to collection or accumulation of gas bubbles which are produced by this bacteria. The moist gangrene superimposed with pus-producing bacteria, which proliferate in the area of necrosis, and this type of gangrene characteristically appear with rotten, متعفن, and is very foul smelling، رائحة متعفنة وكريهة جدا، due to putrefaction التفسخ أو التعفن of affected يعني organ، اللي قلنا particularly يكون اللم or foot، as here. This is a typical example of liquefied wet gangrene in lower extremity, and this case is a term of wet gangrene superimposed coagulative necrosis, superimposed with pus-producing bacteria, and appear affected limb as putrefied, and this fragmentation in association with swelling of affected organ due to a collection of liquefied material or pus or suppurative material. This is a typical example of wet gangrene. العفو moist gangrene. هنا احنا جاي نحكي عن المويست gangrene. ذاك هو الويت gangrene. المويست gangrene قلنا superimposed with pus producing bacteria which proliferate in necrotic area, and this type of gangrene characteristically appear rotten, very foul smelling, putrefaction, يكون متعفن و associated with يعني bad smell. While the wet gangrene يكون superimposed with bacterial infection, and this bacterial infection resulting in liquefactive component of affected area. يعني also يعني pus similar to pus liquefaction، لأنه قلنا بالliquefactive هو bacteria local infection of bacteria associated with infiltration of neutrophils، فراح يصير بها الاريا liquefaction. but تكون associated with inflammation of surrounding or adjacent non-necrotic or non-affected area, such as inflammation of surrounding connective tissue, which called cellulitis. And in this type the area of gangrene appears swells and oozes fluid، وتنضح للسوائل مثل هاي. typical example about wet gangrene appear swelled and distracted, and appear sloughing of external or يعني layer of skin, sloughing of external layer of skin, and also appear swell. This is typical example of wet gangrene. This is example about dry gangrene, as we say. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.